the woman history would remember as Fu, the silent, entered the palace of Emperor Yuan of Han, not with ceremony, but with discretion. Born into the modestly ranked Fu family of the late Western Han Dynasty, Fu Yijie was selected to serve in the imperial harem during a period of political uncertainty. The court was crowded with consorts, dowagers, ministers, and factions, each vying for influence in a system where titles masked instability and favor could vanish overnight. Fu brought no major clan to bolster her presence, no immediate alliances to protect her. What she carried instead was attentiveness. She studied court rhythms with care, understanding early that speech held weight, but silence moved deeper. As a consort, she remained unobtrusive in public matters, while slowly rising in private regard. Her beauty was noted, but it was her restraint that left a lasting impression on the emperor. She did not draw attention to herself, but she never let herself be forgotten. Her position became more secure when she bore a son, Liu Ao, in 51 BCE, a birth that elevated her from favored companion to a political figure. At that time, the reigning empress, Wang Jingjun, also had a son, Liu Kang, though his standing as heir was never beyond challenge. The emperor's affections toward Fu and the charisma of her son slowly shifted the court's internal balance. But the Han bureaucracy, deeply conservative and anchored by lineage traditions, did not bend quickly. Even as Fu became one of the most trusted women in the inner court, her status remained technically subordinate to Empress Wang. In a palace structured around appearances, that distinction was everything. Over the following years, Fu Yijie lived within a palace whose outward decorum masked growing tension. Her son's favor with the emperor grew, but so did the risks to his claim. Every celebration for her child's achievements was measured against the political consequences of elevating him. Emperor Yuan himself remained cautious. He delayed formal succession decisions, knowing that naming one heir would alienate powerful factions linked to the other. Fu watched the indecision from within, carefully navigating relationships with eunuchs, tutors, and court ladies, knowing that any misstep could mean exile or worse. She never campaigned openly for her son's future. Instead, she relied on consistency, presenting herself as the devoted mother, the restrained consort, the quiet presence who offered no threat, only loyalty. Behind that image, however, a more strategic mind was at work. Fu supported the cultivation of allies in low places, chamberlains, record keepers, and the lower bureaucracy. She understood that decisions in the Han court were shaped not only by ministers and nobles, but by the stewards, who managed appointments, ceremonies, and imperial schedules. Her restraint in the public court allowed her to move more freely in the private corridors. She made no demands, but over time, access to the emperor increasingly flowed through her quarters. When Emperor Yuan finally named Liu Ao as crown prince in 33 BC, it appeared a balanced decision. But in practice, it marked the beginning of Fu's gradual ascent beyond rank. Even after the announcement, her standing remained ambiguous. Empress Wang retained her title, and Fu was not elevated to Empress Dowager despite being the crown prince's mother. This created a rare political fracture. A mother of the future emperor with no formal power, and a reigning empress whose influence no longer reflected the emperor's heart. Fu did not challenge the arrangement publicly. She continued her role as consort, never contesting Empress Wang in the open, never suggesting a shift in protocol. But the decision placed her in a delicate position. Loved by the emperor, ignored by the structure. It was a space she understood well. She had occupied it from the beginning. As the emperor aged, so too did the stakes. The palace grew colder with calculation, and those who had once dismissed Fu as harmless began to reconsider. Her son, now a young man, received tutelage and court exposure at a pace unusual for crown princes. His public appearances were accompanied by figures increasingly drawn from Fu's network. It was clear he was being prepared not only to inherit power, but to consolidate it. Still, Fu remained formally voiceless in court proceedings. She had no seal of office, no right to audience with ministers. Yet her son's speech patterns mirrored hers. His preferences reflected her views. In the final years of Emperor Yuan's reign, the balance of influence shifted again. Empress Wang's family, especially the Wangs of the outer court, began to position themselves for the coming succession. Fu responded not with confrontation, but with absence. She withdrew further from the outer court and focused on securing the internal loyalties that would matter after the emperor's death. The moment of transition was coming, and she would not meet it as empress or dowager, but as something else, something quieter and far more enduring. Liu Ao's early years unfolded under the delicate architecture of imperial suspicion. Though his father, Emperor Yuan, held a deep personal affection for both Fu Yijie and their son, affection in the Han court meant little without legitimacy. Fu's position as a favored consort gave her access, but not authority, and every step she took in raising her son was bound by the protocols that preserved hierarchy. Empress Wang Jingjun, wife of the emperor and mother of Liu Kang, occupied the highest female rank in the palace. Her influence extended far beyond ceremony. Her family, the Wang clan, had begun embedding itself into the fabric of imperial bureaucracy. A quiet takeover masked as tradition. For Fu, whose son had the emperor's love, but not the state's acknowledgment, this imbalance posed a silent but urgent threat. As Liu Ao passed from childhood into adolescence, his growing presence in court life stirred tensions. He was composed, reflective, and carried himself with a reserve that mirrored his mother's. He did not display his ambitions, but he did not suppress them either. Ministers began to note the emperor's increasing reliance on his judgment in small matters, a gesture that suggested future preference. Still, the title of Crown Prince remained fixed on Liu Kang, a choice protected by protocol and defended by Wang Jingjun's expanding circle. The empress had no need to voice her resistance. The machinery of succession, built over generations, operated in her favor. Fu knew this, and knew also that direct confrontation would lead to ruin. Her task was not to challenge Wang's power, but to survive beside it, long enough for circumstance to shift. She focused instead on rituals of presence, guiding her son through palace etiquette, aligning him with eunuchs loyal to her household, and ensuring that his actions in court remained unimpeachable. She trained him in patience, the same weapon she had used for years. In public, she deferred to Wang Jingjun. In private, she shaped Liu Ao's understanding of the court's real mechanics, the invisible hierarchy of servants, tutors, scribes, and minor officials whose favor could matter more than that of a single general. Unlike many mothers of noble sons, she did not urge him to be bold. She urged him to be watchful. In this period, Fu's strength emerged not through open displays of influence, but through what she withheld. She did not press Emperor Yuan for titles. She did not confront other consorts. Instead, she allowed the emperor to feel that his affections and his decisions were his own. This illusion of autonomy was key. The emperor, weary of political intrigue, preferred those who did not ask. And so, Fu's silence became a form of persuasion. Ministers, too, began to see in her a figure of calm continuity, someone who did not threaten their ranks or demand elevation. But beneath the serenity was calculation. Every lack of ambition she projected only increased the space she could quietly control. When illnesses befell rival consorts or their children, no accusations were made, but whispers traveled through the silk-draped corridors. Fu said nothing when Liu Ao was praised in court annals for his composure, his education, and his filial piety. It was presented as natural virtue, not maternal strategy. Even as the Wang family strengthened its hold on court appointments, Fu did not object. She waited. She watched as Empress Wang's son, Liu Kang, grew increasingly distant from his father, his behavior marked by impulsiveness and political missteps. Where Liu Ao reflected his father's restraint, Liu Kang seemed to lean too heavily on the security of his title. By the late years of Emperor Yuan's reign, uncertainty clouded the court. Advisors offered differing views on succession, veiled in the language of loyalty and ritual. Some pointed to Liu Kang's weakening ties to the moral image of rulership. Others quietly favored Liu Ao for his discipline and reflection. Fu did not speak in these debates, nor did she interfere in them. She knew the weight of an unspoken preference, and she trusted that the emperor's long observation of his sons would reach its own conclusion. To be seen as the mother of the more suitable heir without asking for it was the most powerful position she could hope to achieve. The decision would not be hers, but it could be shaped, and every glance, every silence, every withheld ambition, all of it was shaping something. The appointment of Liu Ao as crown prince in 33 BCE marked a formal acknowledgment of a reality that had long been building inside the Imperial Court. It affirmed what had been silently understood, that Fu Yiji's son had become the center of the emperor's vision for succession. But even as this shift restructured the future of the Han Dynasty, it did not elevate Fu in equal measure. Her influence, undeniable in practice, remained unrecognized in title. She was the mother of the heir apparent, yet not the empress. The court moved forward under strict observance of ritual order. And in that order, it was still Wang Zhengjun who held precedence. The emperor did not alter her rank, and Fu remained a consort, a Zhao, distant from the center of visible power, but closer than anyone to the man who shaped it. In the final years of Emperor Yuan's reign, Fu's quarters became an unofficial seat of influence. Appointments were discussed there before they reached the council. Messages passed through her chamber before reaching her son. Ministers and eunuchs alike began to understand that proximity to Fu was a matter not of flattery, but of foresight. Her interventions were subtle and spaced. She did not interfere in policy directly, but she guided decisions by adjusting those who delivered them. The emperor's health was deteriorating, and with it, the clarity of the court's structure. But Fu remained constant, not in the lineage of rank, but in the logic of power. When the emperor died in 33 BCE, The transition came as expected. Liu Hao ascended the throne as Emperor Cheng. The state observed its rituals. Wang Zhengjun, as the widow of the deceased emperor, became Empress Dowager, a title rooted in status, not motherhood. In this system, Fu was given no new designation. She did not become Empress Dowager, Grand Empress Dowager, or any of the traditional honors reserved for the mothers of emperors. Her position became one of administrative ambiguity. She was the biological mother of the Son of Heaven, yet unacknowledged in the hierarchy that governed the empire's visual structure. What she held was not conferred by decree, but enforced by familiarity. Emperor Cheng revered his mother. His regard for her shaped the behavior of those around him. Audiences granted to officials often followed visits to her chamber. Imperial ceremonies were structured to pass through her presence. While she lacked the public voice of a dowager, she held the private weight of one. In the palace, where titles governed movement and speech, hers remained technically frozen. Yet she moved as if titled, and few dared to correct her. Her staff expanded. Her relatives were elevated. Her advice was sought not through formal channels, but through quiet inquiries passed between attendants and gatekeepers. She did not occupy a seat at state rituals, but her absence was as carefully considered as her presence would have been. This duality of being essential yet excluded defined her power. It created a space in which she could act with influence while remaining shielded from accountability. She was not held to the standards of a dowager because she was not one, yet everyone treated her as something greater than a consort. Ministers navigated this uncertainty with caution. Some aligned with her household in hopes of future favor. Others kept their distance, wary of a woman whose authority was not written but enforced through the emperor's gaze. The Wang clan, still anchored by Wang Zhengjun's new position as Empress Dowager, did not confront Fu directly, but they tightened their control of court appointments and ritual precedents. They relied on the bureaucracy's deference to titles, the one tool Fu had never been granted. But titles alone did not govern the daily operations of power. Decisions had to be made. Messages had to be relayed. And in these spaces between ceremony and necessity, Fu held steady. She did not demand elevation. She did not protest the silence surrounding her rank. Instead, she allowed others to debate what she should be called, while she continued shaping what would be done. In a palace built on names, she ruled without one. Fu Yijie remained in the palace after her son ascended as Emperor Cheng, but the structure of the Han court made clear what she would, and would not, become. Despite being the emperor's biological mother, she was not granted the title of Empress Dowager. That role was inherited without question by Wang Zhengjun, the widow of the late Emperor Yuan. It was not an issue of merit or closeness, but of hierarchy. The Imperial Court followed titles, not bloodlines, and Fu's lack of official standing during Emperor Yuan's reign followed her into the next. She remained Zhao, a senior consort without political designation, confined by a name that carried neither authority nor ceremony. The emperor loved her deeply, and her quarters reflected that quiet reverence. But outside the confines of his affection, she met resistance at every corridor of state. The Han bureaucracy, deeply invested in continuity and order, resisted any redefinition of court structure. Ministers who owed their careers to the Wang family stood firm against any suggestion that Fu should be elevated. Doing so would destabilize precedents, weaken Empress Dowager Wang's position, and invite questions about lineage legitimacy. The Wang clan, embedded in administrative offices and provincial posts, reinforced these boundaries in quiet, persistent ways. Documents avoided mention of Fu's maternal status. Court announcements listed Wang Zhengjun first in all ceremonies. The imperial ancestral rites gave no formal place to Fu as a mother empress. Her son could show affection privately, but publicly, protocol dictated his loyalty. Fu understood the court's rigidity. She did not challenge it openly. Instead, she began to shape influence through presence and proximity. Her quarters became an informal extension of the emperor's will. Those who sought audience with Emperor Cheng often paused first at her residence, careful to acknowledge her standing, even if the state did not. She controlled appointments not through signatures, but through suggestions passed down quietly, through the hands of eunuchs, tutors, and inner attendants. Her words never reached court scrolls, but they shaped what those scrolls contained. Still, every time her name was absent from official records, it reminded her that her position remained conditional. She was indispensable to her son, yet dispensable to the state. Her family, the Fu clan, became the most visible extension of her growing yet unofficial power. Her brother Fu Yan rose rapidly through court ranks, holding both military and ceremonial roles. Other relatives were granted posts in regional commanderies or attached to imperial inspection bodies. These placements were subtle but significant. They gave Fu eyes and ears across the empire and slowly built a network that mirrored the Wang family's own. But unlike the Wangs, the Fus had no founding empress to justify their presence. Their power rested entirely on favor, fragile, personal, and easily revocable. Fu never forgot this. She managed her relatives' rise with calculated modesty, never asking too much at once, always appearing surprised when promotions arrived. While Empress Dowager Wang presided over state rituals in visible form, Fu moved behind screens, through intermediaries, and within the emperor's shadow. Her influence grew through the logic of service. She offered calm counsel, protected her son's preferences, and avoided direct confrontation with the court's conservative factions. But the tension between what she meant to the emperor and what she meant to the court never eased. Her status remained an unresolved contradiction, too powerful to ignore, too irregular to elevate. Ministers whispered about protocol violations and unnatural influence. Court chroniclers took care to minimize her footprint. Even her name, when mentioned in official histories, was often reduced to her title, Zhao Yi, as if to contain her within a category that no longer fit. Yet within this confinement, she found control. Without the formal title of Empress Dowager, she was exempt from its responsibilities, its rituals, and its public scrutiny. She was not held accountable for state failures, but her counsel shaped the men who would be. She did not issue edicts, but her suggestions carried the weight of law. And while her son ruled from the throne, it was often her silence that decided what could not be spoken. The court of Emperor Cheng grew increasingly polarized as the Fu family's fortunes rose in tandem with Fu Yiji's standing, though still denied formal recognition as Empress Dowager. Her influence over her son shaped appointments, honors, and internal decisions at the highest levels of government. Her brother Fuyan became the most visible symbol of this ascent. Granted military responsibilities and later entrusted with ceremonial roles that placed him close to the emperor, Fuyan moved swiftly through the ranks of command. His proximity to both the throne and his sister made him an instrument of influence, not just a brother, but a proxy. Through him, Fu Yijie extended her reach into the public machinery of state without needing to issue orders herself. The rise of the Fu clan triggered an inevitable response from the Wang family. Empress Dowager Wang Zhengjun, though outwardly restrained, remained at the center of a sprawling network of siblings, nephews, and cousins embedded across the bureaucracy. Her brothers, particularly Wang Feng and Wang Gen, had held court offices for years and interpreted the growing power of the Fus as a direct challenge to the dynasty's institutional order. Unlike the Fu clan, the Wangs had legitimacy and precedent. Their sister had once been empress and now served as the formal dowager. Their status was not dependent on the emperor's shifting favor, but on the stability of titles and inherited court structure. For them, the Fu clan's acceleration posed not only a political inconvenience, but a breach of ritual boundaries. Within this tension, court dynamics became increasingly performative. Appointments, once made through ministerial consultation, now required secondary approval, either implicitly or through delayed responses, depending on which family stood behind the nominee. Small gestures, such as attending banquets hosted by Fu Yiji or bowing first to Wang Zhengjun during rituals, became quiet declarations of allegiance. Officials and palace staff tread carefully, each visit and letter an act of political calibration. The factions did not openly oppose each other, but each side monitored court behavior with forensic attention. Even silence could be taken as a declaration. Fu Yijie managed the rise of her clan with deliberate control. She avoided aggressive demands and rarely requested appointments outright. Instead, she allowed Fu Yan and others to be placed through natural-seeming promotions. Promotions were timed carefully, never too many at once, never so rapid as to provoke a direct rebuke. But despite the outward restraint, the pattern was clear. The Fus were becoming what the Wangs had once been, a political family whose private influence ran parallel to the official state hierarchy. Wang Zhengjun watched this unfold from within the inner palace, her formal role still intact, but increasingly overshadowed by the behavior of the emperor himself. He continued to visit his mother's quarters often, and the symbolism of his movements, more than any decree, defined the new order. The tension rarely broke into direct confrontation, but its presence saturated court life. Ministerial factions aligned subtly with one family or the other. Proposals for taxation, infrastructure, or military reform were evaluated not only for content, but for origin. Even ceremonial duties, who presided over ancestral rites, who stood closest during investitures, became matters of whispered judgment. At the center of this careful division stood two women, one bound by title and precedent, the other by blood and influence. Neither spoke against the other in formal channels, but both understood the balance that hung between their families. Fu Yijie never moved to displace Wang Zhengjun. She did not need to. Every concession the court made to her presence, every honor shown to her brother, chipped at the assumption that the Wangs alone defined continuity. It was not a sudden shift, but a slow erosion of ritual dominance, of bureaucratic neutrality, of the belief that favor and family could be held apart. The Han court was becoming something else, a space where protocol was still spoken, but power was decided in silence. Fu Yiji's influence over Emperor Cheng remained strongest in its most personal form, not through edicts or councils, but through the steady, emotional reach of a mother's presence. Her son consulted her often and adjusted his decisions around her preferences. While ministers debated state matters in official sessions, many appointments and dismissals were quietly sealed in conversations behind silk screens, moments after the emperor's visits to his mother's quarters. She shaped the tone of ceremonies, the selection of attendants, and the approval of noble families granted access to the palace's inner circle. Her voice did not carry through court records, but it carried through him. In a dynasty governed by hierarchy, it was the private bond between mother and son that bent procedure without breaking it. Among the matters most closely guarded by Fu was the emperor's romantic life, the selection of consorts, the status of palace women, and even the timing of imperial weddings passed through her judgment. She claimed to be protecting her son from political entanglements, ensuring that no family gained too much influence through a marriage alliance. But this control had consequences. Years passed, and Emperor Cheng failed to produce a legitimate heir. The absence grew heavier with each season, and in a court where succession determined stability, concern turned to suspicion. Rumors emerged quietly, then spread in cautious tones. Some questioned the emperor's health, others hinted at deeper causes, ones that pointed not to him, but to the women around him, or more precisely, to the woman who determined who remained. Stories filtered through palace staff about sudden illnesses among consorts and attendants. Names appeared briefly in records, then vanished. A few women were promoted, only to be reassigned or confined for unexplained reasons. The court never confirmed wrongdoing. No charges were ever brought. But the pattern became difficult to ignore. Whispers began to circulate that Fu Yiji's interference was not just administrative, that she was ensuring her son remained childless, at least from women she could not control. Some believed she feared the emergence of a powerful empress, someone who might supplant her unspoken role in the palace. Others accused her of poisoning rivals, of orchestrating the rotation of concubines to prevent any from gaining lasting favor, of blocking pregnancies through methods no official dared document. These rumors found fertile ground in the structural ambiguity surrounding Fu. She was not Empress Dowager, yet she wielded the influence of one. She had no ceremonial authority, yet her decisions shaped imperial intimacy. Her family's growing prominence only deepened suspicion. If the emperor died without an heir, the Fu clan's position would become precarious. Maintaining the status quo, some speculated, was her insurance. She had learned long ago that power without recognition required constant maintenance. And in the absence of formal legitimacy, controlling who bore the next emperor may have felt like her last defense. Emperor Cheng never publicly addressed the concerns. He continued to visit his mother and deferred to her in personal matters. His loyalty appeared unshaken, even as his inability to produce an heir began to disturb the broader court. The Wang family, still embedded in the bureaucracy, began pushing for clearer succession plans. Empress Dowager Wang Zhengjun though outwardly detached, allowed her relatives to raise concerns discreetly, not about Fu directly, but about the pattern of deaths and delays that surrounded the palace's younger women. The court could not accuse without proof, and Fu gave them none. Her restraint remained exact. She made no demands, offered no defense, and kept her focus on the emperor's schedule, his movements, and his private world, the only world where her position could not be challenged. Inside that world, she continued to shape outcomes. When new women entered the palace, their households were quietly inspected. Their conduct was monitored by attendants loyal to her. Pregnancy among consorts became rare, and when it occurred, complications followed. Physicians said little. Eunuchs repeated what they were told. The emperor grieved, but never acted. And through it all, Fu remained exactly where she had always been, without title, without ceremony, and yet closer to the throne than anyone. The arrival of Zhao Feiyan and Zhao Hede into Emperor Qing's inner circle marked a turning point, not only in court culture, but in the equilibrium of power that Fu Yijie had spent years maintaining. The sisters, renowned for their beauty, grace, and calculated charm, rose swiftly from relative obscurity to become central figures in the emperor's life. They were not born into powerful clans, but they navigated the palace with precision, understanding that affection, once earned, could become its own form of leverage. Their influence expanded rapidly. Rituals were rearranged to accommodate them. Imperial resources redirected to favor their households, and their names began appearing in court records with increasing frequency. Where Fu had once shaped her son's world in quiet solitude, she now found herself displaced by voices younger, bolder, and less encumbered by tradition. Fu recognized the danger immediately. The sisters did not seek influence through deference, but through presence. They spoke to the emperor as companions, not as courtiers, and their ascent mirrored the same patterns that had once defined her own. To Fu, it felt like watching history repeat, but this time, from the wrong side. She had once been the woman reshaping power from behind veils and protocol. Now she stood outside, watching her son turn toward others who knew how to speak in the tones of affection and urgency. The decisions that once flowed through her chambers began to shift. Her opinions, though still respected, carried less urgency. Her brother Fu Yan noticed it too. His standing, once secured through proximity to the emperor, began to weaken. Recommendations he made met resistance. His assignments became more ceremonial, less strategic. Then the court began to bleed. The deaths started quietly. A low-ranking eunuch found unresponsive, a court lady dismissed for illness and never seen again. The imperial physician, once a steady presence in both Fu's and the emperor's quarters, was replaced without explanation. Then, more prominently, several nobles associated with the Fu family, or known to frequent their quarters, died under uncertain circumstances. Illness was the official explanation each time, and no formal accusations were made. But the timing, the alignment of loyalties, and the growing emboldenment of the Zhao sisters made the pattern impossible to ignore. When Fu Yan himself died, sudden, unexplained, with no signs of lingering disease, the message to Fu Yijie was unmistakable. Her family's security, once tethered to the emperor's affection, now depended on something else entirely. Survival within an empire slowly turning against itself. No proof was presented, No investigations were opened. The palace operated in whispers. Servants were rotated more frequently. Old attendants disappeared without notice. Fu's influence, though still intact on paper, had been hollowed from within. The Zhao sisters had learned to protect themselves by shifting not only favor but fear. Those who spoke against them found themselves removed. Those who remained learned to adapt. Even the emperor, worn down by the demands of succession and the weight of appearances, began to retreat from confrontation. He did not denounce his mother, but he no longer shielded her either. His grief for Fu Yan was subdued. His visits to Fu Yijie grew more formal, more spaced. Within this tightening atmosphere, Fu moved carefully. She withdrew from certain rituals and reduced her contact with court officials. The space she had once filled with influence became quieter. Not out of defeat, but out of caution. She had witnessed how swiftly favor turned lethal. The court still dressed itself in ceremony and protocol, but the structure beneath was cracking. Alliances no longer held. Ambitions rose without lineage. The palace that once followed ritual now followed instinct, and instinct had turned toward violence. The dynasty no longer needed open conflict to devour itself. It needed only silence, absence, and decisions made without explanation. By the final years of Emperor Cheng's reign, Fu Yijie no longer recognized the palace she had once quietly shaped. The familiar routes of influence she had walked for decades. Through personal loyalty, maternal affection, and behind-the-curtain negotiation, had been rerouted without her. Her son, once tethered to her in both habit and judgment, had drifted away under the growing shadow of the Zhao sisters and the constant pressures of an emperor without an heir. He no longer visited as often. Requests she made took longer to be answered, or were ignored altogether. Her counsel, once a cornerstone of his private deliberations, now belonged to others. She remained within the walls of the inner court, but her presence had shifted from essential to tolerated. Without the prospect of a grandson to carry on her line, Fu's political existence became increasingly unstable. Her identity, so long bound to her son's future and her family's upward momentum, began to fracture. Every year that passed without an heir was another year her position eroded. Ministers began preparing for succession in her son's absence, and that preparation rarely involved her. The Wang family, still entrenched in the bureaucracy through Empress Dowager Wang Zhengjun's extensive kinship network, reclaimed their influence with quiet persistence. They positioned themselves as the guardians of continuity, offering the court a sense of predictability that Fu's dwindling circle could no longer provide. The Zhao sisters, still dominant in the emperor's personal life, further insulated themselves from court pressure. Their movements were protected by an expanded network of loyal eunuchs and palace servants, and they commanded influence not through lineage, but through constant proximity. They knew how to maintain the emperor's attention, and more importantly, how to keep others from it. Their presence redefined access. Those who once sought favor through Fu now sought it through them. Even officials who had once aligned with the Fu clan began shifting their alliances, adopting more neutral tones, more careful speech. Survival depended on subtlety. For Fu, the isolation was not ceremonial. It was operational. Her brother was dead. Her family's name, once spoken with deference, now appeared less frequently in appointments. Even small rituals began to exclude her. Invitations to banquets were delayed or omitted. Attendance at rites was no longer expected. The palace had not exiled her, but it had learned how to forget her in steps. She watched from her quarters as younger women moved through halls once reserved for senior figures, as officials spoke more openly about alternative lines of succession, and as her own legacy faded into a space too murky to defend. With no title to anchor her, and no child beyond the emperor to secure her relevance, Fu was left with only her memory of power, and the awareness that its loss had come not through rebellion, but through attrition. She did not fall. She was erased. Strategically, methodically, and without scandal. The same court that once operated on deference to her silence now moved forward without it. Her former allies hesitated to visit. Those who remained loyal knew better than to be seen. Even servants grew careful in their speech around her chambers, their greetings shorter, their footsteps faster. She had no direct enemies to confront. No accusations had been made. No decrees stripped her of influence. Instead, she faced something more absolute. A world that no longer required her. The machinery of succession moved forward, led by those who had survived longer, spoken less, or aligned themselves more effectively with the palace's new rhythm. In this world, Fuyiji became a reminder of an older era, one whose tools of power, patience, presence, restraint, no longer guaranteed survival. Her name was still known, but it was no longer spoken in deference. It was used with caution, with calculation, with quiet unease. In circa BCE, the silence surrounding Fuyijie ended not with tribute, but with absence. Her death, recorded in official documents as the result of illness, was delivered to the court with minimal ceremony. No special rites were held. No elevation in title followed. No public mourning was ordered. The woman who had once shaped the rhythm of the imperial palace through quiet presence was now reduced to a brief entry in the annals of Han. For those who had watched her decline, the official explanation rang hollow. Illness, though plausible, was not persuasive. Her health had not been reported as failing, and her movements within the palace, though limited, had continued in the weeks before. Instead, the court responded to the news with the kind of practiced stillness that suggested deeper knowledge. No questions were raised. No investigations were opened. It was not an announcement. It was a conclusion. Within the palace walls, speculation took root. Some whispered that Fu had taken her own life, driven by isolation and the erosion of her family's influence. Others believed it had been arranged, a quiet execution by poisoned wine or herb, delivered under imperial order or with the emperor's silent approval. The details remained unrecorded, and no one sought to clarify them. The court had learned to speak around such absences. What mattered was not the cause, but the convenience of the outcome. Fu's removal simplified succession planning. It eased tensions between factions. It eliminated the need for further debate about titles that had never fit and influence that had long grown inconvenient. In the days following her death, the Fu clan collapsed in formality and in favor. Her surviving relatives were dismissed from court rolls, their names quietly omitted from ceremonial rosters. Lands previously granted to the family were reassigned. Titles were revoked without public statement. The erasure did not require explanation. The loss of her presence had made their position untenable. Those who had once risen through proximity to her understood what was expected. They distanced themselves. Ministers who had sought her counsel years earlier now restructured their affiliations, aligning more firmly with the Wang family or withdrawing altogether. Loyalty became retroactive, and memory became selective. Even within the archive rooms, her name began to disappear. Historians, scribes, and court recorders altered the language of previous entries, rewording or reordering passages to minimize her role. The term Zhao Yi remained, but it became detached from decision-making. The policies she had influenced, the appointments she had shaped, were reattributed where possible. It was not a coordinated effort, but an organic one, a collective instinct for self-preservation. In a court that prized ritual continuity, her story became an inconvenience, and the path to stability was paved in omission. The emperor said little. His public behavior remained composed, and no extended mourning period was declared. He moved forward with court business as though the loss had been administrative, not personal. Whether this restraint reflected guilt, fatigue, or cold necessity remained unknown. What was clear was that her death closed a chapter the court had long avoided addressing. She had existed in contradiction, powerful without title, mother without recognition, indispensable yet unacknowledged. In death, the contradiction became too large to maintain. So the solution was silence. But silence itself can leave a mark. Within the palace, attendants remembered her quiet steps, her careful orders, her ability to redirect the flow of power without raising her voice. In private, some still spoke of her with caution, not because she remained a threat, but because her absence still framed the court's decisions. Her influence had vanished, but the structures she once manipulated remained shaped by her hands. The names that replaced hers had learned from her, in strategy, in restraint, in the importance of never asking for more than the court was willing to give. Her legacy was never written, but neither was it forgotten. Fu Yiji died without the honors her position as mother to an emperor might have promised. She never wore the garments of Empress Dowager, never sat at the center of court ritual, never saw her name inscribed beside those of formerly consecrated rulers. Yet for nearly 2 decades, she operated at the very heart of the Han court, not through titles, but through bonds. Her influence had no edict, no seal, no proclamation, but it moved through the body of the dynasty with the precision of law. She ruled through relationships, with her son, with eunuchs, with the flow of ritual and rumor. Her rise traced a line of power that lived outside the visible mechanisms of empire, showing that control did not always require a name, only access, timing, and patience. She never held formal power, but she understood it, and she understood how to move it. Her story was one of contradiction. She served an emperor as his consort, but was never empress. She bore the future ruler of China, but was never granted the dignity of the mother empress. When that son rose to power, she gained a sphere of influence vast in reach but invisible in structure. Every policy she shaped passed through another's hand. Every family she elevated did so under another's name. Her decisions left no trace in court archives, but shaped the lives of those who depended on imperial favor to rise or survive. Her power was maternal, but not gentle. It was measured, strategic, defensive. She had lived too long in a court that valued appearances above all else to mistake affection for protection. Even the emperor's love could not shield her from the ambitions of others. She used it anyway, as both armor and weapon, until even that began to slip away. Her legacy could not be passed on. Without a grandchild to continue her line, and without official recognition to cement her family's place in history, her clan dissolved almost as quickly as it had risen. What remained was not continuity, but the aftermath of influence. The Zhao sisters, the Wang clan, and the bureaucrats who outlived them all inherited a court reshaped by her absence. Suspicion hardened into standard practice. Informal alliances became institutional defense. The memory of how power had once been wielded without ceremony, without title, without accountability, haunted those who remained. Even after her death, the court became more guarded, less trusting, more dependent on structure and surveillance. Her silence had once been an advantage. Now it became a warning. Official history would never place her beside the great empresses of China, nor among the rulers whose reigns defined dynastic eras. Her contributions would remain shaded, her actions interpreted through the lens of palace intrigue. Some would call her manipulative, painting her as a woman who put ambition above lineage, who interfered in succession, who silenced rivals to preserve her own reach. Others would argue she was maternal to the end, that she acted not for herself, but to protect a son placed in the most dangerous position a court could offer: absolute power without absolute safety. In this view, her caution, her control, even her feared interference were acts of care, distorted by necessity, shaped by a palace that never offered her a clear path to legitimacy. Yet neither portrayal can fully account for the complexity of her role. Fu Yiji existed within a structure designed to use women, reward them sparingly, and forget them easily. She resisted erasure not by declaring herself, but by making herself indispensable. She outlived rivals, protected her son longer than many thought possible, and controlled the rise of her family without ever demanding formal elevation. Her story is not one of triumph, but of survival, and of how proximity to power, in the absence of recognition, can create both influence and isolation. The dynasty she helped sustain would not last much longer. Within a generation, the cracks she had once tried to paper over, with loyalty, with silence, with presence, widened. Emperor Cheng's inability to produce an heir, the rivalries she once held at bay, the bureaucratic fragmentation she had long navigated through personal ties, all returned with greater force after her death. The court grew colder, more ritualized, more fractured. It feared the kind of informal power she had once embodied, and in doing so, only made itself more brittle. Fu Yijie was not remembered with monuments. Her name did not adorn imperial shrines, but her life left its mark in the rhythms of a court that could not decide how to handle women like her, too powerful to ignore, too irregular to embrace. Her strength lay in her restraint, her foresight, her capacity to exist where no place had been made for her. She ruled through margins, and in doing so, reshaped the center. What do you think? Was she a savior or a shadow ruler?